Okay. So first of all, shkoyach to Chaim Bergam. That's Chaim Bergam for sponsoring the breakfast this morning. Learning it should be zachet. It should be a schus for him, for his mishpacha, for Okila, all Klal Yisrael. Okay, so this is a shtickle. I guess I wasn't planning on doing a part 2 from last week, but again another yashikayach to Avram Chaim Noble for the Sefer Emes Yaakov. On Shabbos he gave me the Chelik Beis. So once I got a Chelik Beis, so we have to do a part 2 based on it. So big shkayach to him. To this will be, again, to a certain degree it's part 2, but it also can be understood on its own. But just to give a little bit of a reference, sort of a framing based on last week. So last week what we learned about was is sort of the B'derech Klal, in a general sense, the different types of leadership, of Jewish leadership that we have according to Torah. And basically what we spoke about last week was 3 different, categories, 3 different types of leadership. You have a melech, a king, who is primarily, again, for a lack of a better term, more of a leader in terms of national, political, economical, military. Again, for a lack of a better word, we'll just call it a political leader. That's what we'll call it. That's a melech. Not necessarily is the melech a leader in terms of Torah. He could also be, but the job of melech is a political leader. And then what we had, countering that, we had also was based on the chinuch. I guess for lack of a better term, the Gadol Hadar. The Gadol Hadar is even if without a Sanhedrin, but the Gadol Hadar is the person that is the Torah authority, the Torah leadership, and like the chinuch said that even without a Sanhedrin, whoever this Gadol Hadar is, by way of there's no voting for it or anything like that, but just sort of this subconscious or superconscious consensus of Klal Yisrael who the Gadol Hadar is, such a person has to be followed in terms of Torah decisions and so on. And then we had this other sort of middle hybrid, or whatever you want to call it, called the Nasi / Reish Galusa. And what we also mentioned is that historically, this position of Nasi / Reish Galusa was also the position of the Shoftim, which that came before the times of the kings, from the death of Yeshua ben Nun all the way till the times of Shalom Melech, when Shmuel and Navi anoint Shalom Melech. That was a time where the leadership was under the, where we were led by Shoftim, by judges. The term Shofet is synonymous, sort of in terms of job description, is synonymous with what you'll have later on in Jewish history after the end of Malchus, after the end of the kings, where you have a position of Nasi / Reish Galusa. And so what was that position? So that's what we were trying to sort of like figure out a little bit last week, that's a position that's a little bit of like a hybrid. The person, the Nasi or the Reish Galusa, or again, going back earlier in Jewish history, the Shofet, they were people that they were the Gedolei Hadar. They were the leaders, they were the Torah leaders of the generation, but they also had political leadership. And the power that they wielded was similar to that of a king, although with certain differences. They weren't. It wasn't. The power was not as intense. It wasn't as intense as the Melech, and certainly, as we saw, it didn't go down Yerusha with an inheritance that we had with the Melech. But there was some sort of political power that the Nasi wielded, that the Reish Galusa wielded in Chutz La'aretz, or again going back in early times, the Shofet wielded. And so this is what we were sort of a little bit struggling with last week, to figure out exactly what is this position, how to identify it. Again, on the one hand, they were the Gedolei Hadar, but they also had some level of Malchus to them, albeit again they were not the king. They weren't kings, and they didn't pass down the Malchus B'Yerusha. So that's what we were talking about last week. So last week we saw from Yaakov Kamenetsky that these people were primarily the Gedolei Hadar, and the quality of Malchus that they had was not their own. It was rather they were shluchim of their Rebbeinu Shalom to allow Hashem's Malchus to come into the world. Okay, that's what we spoke about last week. Now, this week, what I want, we're going to sort of go into more, maybe a little bit of a deeper understanding of what this hybrid position is, Nasi / Reish Galusa, and again, like I said, in early generations, the Shofet. Again, because Melech versus Gadol Hadar, that's very binary and very clear. You have, again, the Melech is the political leader, and the Gadol Hadar is the Torah leader. This somewhere in between, the Shofet position, or Nasi / Reish Galusa, who is the Gadol Hadar, and also for for all intents and purposes, also the king. So it's a little bit of a funny thing. How do we figure it out? So that's what we're going to see. We're going to see today. It's based on other Torahs from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky again in this new Sefer. I don't have any. I feel like I'm like promoting it. Like it's a good thing to promote. It's a good Sefer. Happens to be, but I have no skin in the game per se. But it's a good Sefer to learn anyway. So this is going to be a lot based on Viter places in Emes Yaakov that he talks about this sugya. But we'll break it down. What we're going to be focused on though is the position of Shofet. Again, like I said, the position of Shofet that predates kings is similar to what you find post-dating the kings of Nasi / Reish Galusa. But again, we're going to focus on what the Shofet was that came before the kings. That'll be the same Indian as what came after the kings. Okay, so we'll break it down like this.
The Shofet's political rulers. De facto political rulers.
Well, again, like we're going to have to figure that out. They were the Gedolei Hador. They were the leaders of the generation, and they also were the political leaders. But again, usually when it comes to political leaders like a king, it goes down B'Yerusha. The Shoftim, it did not go down B'Yerusha. So that's what we have to figure out. Okay, so Maramaka number 1. So this is a pirush from the Machzor Vitri. The Machzor Vitri is one of the Talmud of Rashi, from the Beis Medrash of Rashi, and so the Machzor Vitri, that sefer is a pirush on many things. So he has a pirush on Pirkei Avos. So the first mission of Pirkei Avos, as we know. So what does it say? Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, right? Masar Yeshua. So the mission over there is talking about the tradition of Torah leadership. That's what it's talking about. So you have Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. He gives over Torah leadership to Yeshua ben Nun. Yeshua gives it to the Zakanim, and the Zakanim give it to the Naviim. Okay, and the Naviim carry the torch of Torah leadership all the way till the end of the first Beis Hamikdash, when the Nevuah ends, and then the Nevi'im give it to the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and so on and so forth. So what the Machzor Vitri is trying to identify, who are these Zakanim? Who are these Zakanim? And in what way are they different than Nevi'im? We had Nevi'im from the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. So like all of a sudden, like the job of Navi, the role, the position, the authority of the Navi only comes after Zakanim. That's right. So if Moshe, Yeshua, fine, so far so good. Then Zakanim, and Zakanim to Nevi'im. I mean, it's not like the Nevuah only started after some time. Nevuah was going on the whole time. So who are these Zakanim, and why is it that during the times of the Zakanim, the Nevi'im are not spoken of, and only after the end of Zakanim, whatever that is, now you have Nevi'im? Well, how do we understand this? Who are these people, and how was the tradition passed? So take a look at the Machzor Vitri. So this is where we're going to begin. So the Machzor Vitri says like this: Yeshua is Zakanim. Yeshua gives Torah leadership over to the Zakanim. So it says in Machzor Vitri, Adei Yeshua nimsur l'Zakanim. Through Yeshua, the Torah was given over, leadership was given over to the Zakanim. Hey Mashayftim. The Zakanim over here in the Mishnah is reference. It means the Shayftim that we had from the times of the end of Yeshua ben Nun's life until Malchus, until the kings. Shamdu Yisrael, the Shayftim that came by the Jew that stood up by the Jewish people. Ad Shemalach Shaul, until Shaul HaMelech became king. The Kari Oisim Zakanim, and the reason why they're called Zakanim is Shekain Derech Limnai Zakanim Al Tzibur, because the Zakain, that's the sage, the person that's supposed to be in charge of the community. So they were called the Zakanim. Now, so what the Machzor Vitri is telling us is an interesting thing, which is that again, so Torah leadership goes from again Moshe to Yeshua to the Shoftim, and from the Shoftim, Torah leadership goes to the Nevi'im. Now, this is where we have to figure out what exactly is this transition from Shoftim to Nevi'im. There were Nevi'im during the times of the Shoftim too. So what's going on over here? So we'll see like this. So in Maramukah number 2, there's a pasuk in Sefer Shmuel. It's a fascinating story. The pasuk is talking about when Shaul HaMelech is going to be anointed as a king. He doesn't know it yet, but there's a whole mice over there that his father, Shaul HaMelech's father, had a bunch of donkeys and what do you call it, a flock? I don't know what you call it, a group of donkeys. They got lost, and so he sends Shaul, his son, with one of his helpers to go find the assignments to find the donkeys. So the pasuk says that they were passing by a particular place, and in this place happens to be Shmuel Navi was there. Shmuel Navi was there. So the Gabbai of Shaul says to him, the helper says to him, no, there's a roya, there's a seer in this place. Now there's a Navi in this city. He calls him a roya, a seer. Let's go ask the roya where the donkeys are, and he'll help us out. And that was clearly a thing to do, to go to the Navi and ask him your personal questions, even Akadekach, to talk about the donkeys. And so that's the whole ma'aser that he goes there, and Shmuel sees Shaul and realizes, this is going to be the future king. and history unfolds. But that was the moment of when the meeting between Shaul and Shmuel is regarding this inyan. So the pasuk over there, again, when the Gabbai tells Shaul Hamela, Shaul, who's going to be the king, let's go see the Navi. He doesn't call him the Navi. What does he call him? He calls him the Raya, the seer. So the pasuk in Sefer Shmuel sort of interjects in the story to give a little bit of a historical background on the title that we give to people that are prophets. So it's an interesting thing. It says a pasuk like this, Maramuk number 2, Lifnim Yisrael. The pasuk says why the helper of Shaul called Shmuel not the Navi, but he called Shmuel the seer. Lifnim Yisrael, because in earlier times, says the pasuk, anyone that wanted to go seek out Hashem, in other words, to go to a prophet, they would say the following thing: let's go see the seer. Now it says the pasuk, in earlier times, a prophet was called the one that sees. What we call today a Navi used to be called a Raya. That's the pasuk. Now, obviously, the Mefarshim deal with this. It's a very funny thing for the pasuk to interject with this little bit of a historical tidbit. That, by the way, he's being called a Raya. That's what they used to call him. Nowadays, we call him a Navi. First of all, what's the difference between a Raya and a Navi? Why all of a sudden is this a necessary thing to know right now in this story? Okay, so Maramaka number 3 of Yaakov Kamenetsky explains the context of what's going on over here, and it's just like this. Again, so he said like this: the Shoftim, Mapsavitri explained to us that Torah leadership was by Moshe to Yeshua, and then to the Shoftim, and from the Shoftim to the Navi. Okay, so Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky explains like this. This is again on Sefer Shmuel in that pasuk. Hashoftim hayu achrayim l'shnei dvarim gam yachad. When after he says what he says, it's mamash like it's clear in Navi that this is how it is, but he lays it out very nicely. Hashoftim hayu achrayim l'shnei dvarim gam yachad. The Shoftim at that during the times of Shoftim after Yeshua ben Nun, they were responsible for two things. They had two jobs. Lan Hogas Klal Yisrael, they had the responsibility of leading the Jewish people in terms of political authority. Okay, and also to be the Torah authorities to pass down the torch of Torah from one generation to the next. In other words, the Shoftim had these dual roles. That's what we said. That's what we already saw last week. That the Shoftim, these two roles, they were the Gedolei Hadar in terms of Torah, and that's what was their responsibility. That's what the Mishnah is telling us. Moshe to Yeshua to the Zakenim. That Mishnah is talking about the Messiah, the tradition of Torah. And so the Shoftim had that responsibility of passing Torah from one generation to the next. And it said Rabbi Yaakov, they also had the responsibility of what? Of being the political leaders of the generation. And Rabbi Yaakov goes on to say, again, it's other places where he talks about this in more greater detail, but he says that what was unique to the Shoftim is that their authority in terms of political leadership was sort of was swallowed up under their primary position, which is passing over Torah from one generation to the next. In other words, their primary job and role was Moshe, Yeshua's Zakenim. They were the Gedolei Hadar, they were the leaders of Torah, and that was their primary function. The political leadership of the Jewish people, the national, anything that's on, a national concern for the Jewish people was a subset, was nichlal and contained within that general position of Torah leadership. The Torah leadership at that times of the Shoftim, contained within it the political leadership as well. And so the primary thing was that they were the Messiah at Torah, but it contained within that also was the Hanhagas Ha'umah, leading the Jewish people politically. So he says like this: K'chol yis b'sharsharas HaMessiah, hem yuchlu b'yicholet l'kar neviim, Mosek Hamar al Adam Hamevi Haisei Esayeda Hamitzvah Shel Avram and Chiludar Haba. So he says like this. It says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, I'll tell you outside and then we'll see it inside together. It says Rabbi Yaakov like this: during the times of the Shoftim, whenever there was a question of Ratzon Hashem, of a Torah type of question that was on a national stage, you would go to the Shofet. That's who you would go to. And if you had questions about anything militarily or political or anything like that, also you go to the Shofet. Again, the seat of authority was by the Shofet, and the function of the Shofet primarily was the Torah authority, and Le'umius, national political concerns were nichlal in that, they were a part of that. Now, says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky as follows: what was the role of the Navi during that time? So says Rabbi Yaakov, because Rabbi Yaakov says whenever what was the Navi? any concern that you had, any question that you had in terms of das Torah, in terms of understanding what does the Rebbeinu Shalom want, what does Torah demand of us on a national stage, you wouldn't be going to the Navi, you would be going to the Shofet. So the entire function of a Navi at that time was the person that you would go to with individual questions, personal questions, your personal avodah, whether it be your personal ruchnias or your personal gashmias. That's when you would go. You wouldn't have access to the shofet for those types of questions. Personal questions in terms of Torah and in terms of avodas Hashem, you would go to the Navi. But in terms of national questions of Torah and avodah, you would go to the shofet. So says Rabbi Yaakov Mes like this: the term Navi is a word that connotes, that gives off the impression of someone transmitting something from the past to the future. L'nave means like a pipeline. So the word Navi, says Rabbi Yaakov Kaneski, was not appropriate to be used for a prophet during the times of the Shoftim, because the word Navi means someone who has the responsibility of passing something over from one generation to the next. So it was passing the torch of Torah. That was not the Navi's job. That was the Shofet. Now it could be that a Shofet was also a Navi, but the title of Navi was not appropriate just to give someone who happens to be a prophet. The word Navi means the one that's responsible to transmit something from the past to the future, to keep the torch of Torah passing from one generation to the next. That was the Shofet. So what was the Navi about? The prophet, what was his function in Klal Yisrael? His function was on personal inyanim of individual citizens, and their ruchnias or their gashmias. That's where a prophet came from. That's the term roya. So the term roya means a term. What's the difference between a navi versus a roya? They could be the same person. A navi would be a title given to someone whose responsibility as a prophet is to be part of the Messiah, transmitting Torah from one generation to the next. Whereas a roya would be a term more appropriate to be given to someone who's a prophet, whose primary job is helping individual yidden in their inyan. So says the pasuk like this: Lifnim b'Yisrael, before the times of kings, there was no person given the title of Navi, because who was the one responsible to transmit Torah from one generation to the next? It was the Shofet. That's what the Shofet was, and that was his primary job. His role as a political leader was part of that. There was no such thing at that time of the Shoftim as a divide between Torah leadership and political leadership. All there was Torah leadership. And Nichlal in Torah leadership is also political leadership. It's all a question of what the Torah wants of us. That's always the question. So whether to go to war, whether to levy taxes, all these questions that nowadays we think of as a separate category, as a political issue, as opposed to a Torah issue, by the times of the Shoftim, was always Torah issues. And so the person that's primarily in charge of making sure that Torah continues on and is the pillar and the chain and the link of Messiah, who is the Shofet, he was the one that you would go to for all those questions as well. Baruch Nisu B'Gashmi, it was all the same Indian, it was all Torah. Maybe he was a prophet, maybe he wasn't a prophet. What was the role of the prophets at that time? They were left to deal with the individual inyan. That's why they were given the title Roya. But that's what the pasuk is describing over here, is that once you move into the era of Malchus, into the era of kings, then now the job of the Shofet is split in two. The political side of who the Shofet was and the Torah side of who the Shofet was are now divided into two people. The political side of who the Shofet was is now an independent body that's called the Melech, and the Torah leadership of who the Shofet was is now given to the Navi. And so now what you had until now is, again, until the times of Melech, all there was fundamentally was Torah leadership. There was Moshe, there was Yeshua, and the Shoftim. Nichlal, subsumed in Torah leadership, was also political leadership, because political leadership and the nation of the Jewish people, we were not seen, that was not seen as an independent Indian. That was just another sugya in Torah, and the one that's in charge of Torah is in charge of that too. And that was the Shofet. What were the Nevi'im doing? Okay, the Nevi'im were dealing with individual inyanim, individual, personal, private inyanim, ruchnias and gashmis. The transition from Shoftim to the next era was the following: that now the political leadership of the nation is now taken out of that body that's called the leadership of Torah, and it becomes something independent. And now you have two people leading the Jewish people in these two areas. You have the political leadership being isolated to the king, and now you have the Torah leadership being isolated to the Navi. And this is what the Mishnah is telling us in Pirkei Avos, that as far as Torah leadership is concerned, Moshe, Yeshua, Shoftim, but then after Shoftim, where now you have the Tekuf of Melech, of the kings, now Torah leadership is not in the same place as political leadership. Political leadership is by the king. Torah leadership goes from Zakanim to Nevi'im. And this is what the pasuk is saying, is that Dafka at this moment, when Shaul is about to meet Shmuel, which is the beginning of the time period of Malchus, of kings, this is where the pasuk is making this point, is that until this time, a prophet was called a Raya. But going forward, a prophet is going to be called a Navi. Because now what's happening is, once Shaul is established as a king, it means that original position of Shofet, which was until now dealing with all those things, was dealing with Torah and politics at the same time, and all that was left to the Nevi'im, all that was left to the prophets was just to deal with individual people. Now, the Melech is going to take the political side, and the Torah side is going to be given to the Navi. And this is where you have now, in the times of the Nevi'im, these two leaders, and always balancing and checks and balances with each other, which is the Melech for political inyanim and the Navi for Torah inyanim. And this is what's going on. So this is where we'll see it together inside. Here, take a look at the 3 lines into Maramukah number 3. Haraya le'uma zayis. The term Raya, said Rabbi Yaakov, is Haya Adam Prati, Baal Skul and Avias. The word Raya is a description of someone who is an individual person, who's not a national figure. He's not responsible for anything on a national stage. He's an individual person with individual, private powers of prophecy. And and through this power of nevuah that he had as an individual person, he would guide the people, dealing with individual citizens, individual problems. Dealing with individual people, whether dealing with spiritual matters, and all the way down to an issue of where the donkeys are. So that's where you would go for your private inyanim. Bram, but again, when it comes to inyanim, questions of Klal Yisrael, both in terms of Torah, primarily, and also in terms of political inyanim, then that's where those questions would be left at the doorstep of the Shofet. Now again, even if the Shofet was a Navi, he wasn't functioning as the Navi, but as the Shofet, that was his job. Once the period of Shoftim ends, now you have what the Shofet was taking care of everything, now it's divided up between 2 other people. The Malachim Shel Mashal, so now you have kings. The king now dealt with 50% of the issues. He was dealing with the political side. He wasn't the Rebbe. He wasn't the Moira. He wasn't the teacher of the people in terms of Torah. Hanavi and the Navi, until now, was left to deal with individual inyanim. Now he became the leader of the Jewish people in terms of ruchnias. Which was originally the main priority of the Shofet. So in other words, says Rabbi Yaakov, the job that the Shofet until now took care of, is now divided amongst 2 people, between the Melech and the Navi. And that's what's going on. And now, Kemuvan, Hanavi himshech l'yayitz l'hanches hayichidim, b'sheos ishiyos, she's lehem, and it doesn't mean that even going forward, the Navi, who is now given the national role of transmitting Torah from generation to generation, could still deal with individual private inyanim. It doesn't mean that he's not allowed to deal with that anymore. But that's no longer his primary job. El Sha'atu Nikra Navi. Now he's called the Navi, someone that's responsible to transmit Torah from generation to generation. Now, it's interesting. Based on this, Rabbi Yaakov makes a number of interesting observations throughout Navi. And he said in Maramukah number 4, Rabbi Yaakov points out as follows: is that once we have this better definition and better role and better identification of what the job of a Navi was, that the Navi wasn't just a prophet that happens to know the future and it can help you out. That was the job of the Navi during the times of the Shoftim. That's all he needed to be. Someone that you would go with your personal inyanim. All of a sudden, during the times of the kings, though, now the Navi has to step up and be his responsibility is now the Messiah of Ma'ishakilar Messinas or Yeshua is Zakanim Navim. Right? And so says Rabbi Yaakov like this: when that takes place, then not every single person that had prophecy is now going to be the Navi. So Rabbi Yaakov points out like this: in Tanakh, you'll find that there are certain people that they're called Navi, and there are certain people that are called Ha-Navi, the Navi. Yeshaya Ha-Navi, Shmuel Ha-Navi, Nasan Ha-Navi. And then you have people in Tanakh that are not given the title. They're called a Navi, but they're not called with the Hey Hayidiyah, with Ha-Navi. What's the difference? Why some people are they called Ha-Navi and some people not? So it says Rabbi Yaakov like this, Maramok number 4. Nearly, it seems to me, this is in Malachim, Malachim Aleph, Perchaf, nearly. Sheha-Navi im Hey Hayidiyah, when we talk about a Navi, in Tanakh, where a person is identified as not just being a Navi, he's identified as being Ha-Navi, who Navi Memuna L'chlal Yisrael. That's the Navi that is given this general national stage task of being the one to pass the Maser from generation to generation. When Anshik, again, Moshe to Yeshua, Yeshua is a Canaan, L'Neviim, which Neviim? Not everyone that was a Navi was given this responsibility of being the Baalei HaMesayra. There were individual Neviim that were given that task, and they were Neviim. But not every Navi had that. Which Navi was it in any particular generation? Whoever is called by the pasuk as Ha-Navi, that was the person. So he says like this: Who Navi Memuna Klal Yisrael. When it says Ha-Navi, it means he's the Navi that was appointed for Klal Yisrael, Mishram Yuchedis, this specific role, Al Derech Mishmas HaMelech, similar to the king. What the king was politically, the Navi now is Torah-wise. But which Navi is it? Whoever it is, that's called Ha-Navi. Kach Amnam Hayu Shmuel HaNavi, Nasan HaNavi, that's what these people are. Shahayu Manhigim L'Klal. They were not just Royim anymore, they were the Navi for Klal Yisrael. The Kasher HaMelech HaYenitzrach L'Dvar Hashem. And says, now Rabbi Yaakov makes an interesting point. Whenever the Melech needed to make a political decision, so very often, he needed to consult with the Navi to figure out, like, is this also Ratzon Hashem? Like, I understand that my role is political leadership and taxes and military and all that stuff, and your role is Paskin, Shilas, and just general Hanhaga and what Klal Yisrael needs Chizik in and Torah, but we have to communicate with each other. Yeah.
I had an individual question about looking at, you go to any Navi? Is it any different?
Yeah, you would go to any Navi. You would go to any Navi. I don't know, as an individual citizen, you would probably, there would probably be a very long waiting list to Shmuel HaNavi, but you would have your personal Navi of the town, or Navi of the city, that he was your personal manhig.
It's almost like going to your Rebbe.
Yeah, that's how it was. That's how it was. That's not how it was. It happens to be your Rebbe can see through you. You know, it happens to be that your Rebbe can see through you because he's a Navi. You know what I'm saying? So
the Malach, prior to the Malachim, the Shoftim was a singular. There was a one Shoftim.
It was a one Shoftim. No, Shoftim for the generations. Right. Every generation had one Shoftim. That was it.
One Shoftim.
Exactly. The Kasher Melech HaYinitzach L'Dvar Hashem. When the Melech needed to know what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants of me, is this Indian in the political sphere that I'm engaging in? Is this also Ratzon Hashem? El HaNavi HaMiyuchad Hazeh. He would go to the Navi, to HaNavi. Ukeneged HaNavi, Noise HaMishra L'Umis HaZois. And now it says an interesting thing, says Rabbi Yaakov. Based on this, we could appreciate more a famous Gemara. The Gemara says in Brachas that there was a machlokes between Yeshaya HaNavi and Chizkiyahu HaMelech. The Gemara says that Chizkiyahu HaMelech, there was an issue that needed to be taken care of, and Chizkiyahu needed a message. And the question was, who should go to who? So Yeshaya Navi said, I'm the Navi, the Melech should come to me. And Chizkiyahu says, I'm the Melech, the Navi should go to me. And they're British by the way of working it out. What's this machlokes? So machlokes covered. So it says you have to know, this was a fundamental shayla. Yeshaya was not just a Navi, he was Ha-Navi. Which means that Yeshaya Navi is the seat of Torah leadership. Chizkiyahu HaMelech is the seat of political leadership. The shaila is we both are necessary, and we both have to discuss things with each other for sure, checks and balances. But who be'etzim is more chashuv? And that was the question over here. Yeshaya Navi says the Navi is the primary force. Chizkiyahu HaMelech says no. The Melech is the primary force. Which one is superior? We'll see about this soon in a few minutes about Pnimis. Huh? So we'll see about this. Okay, so that's good. So he says like this: So Keneged HaNavi Noise HaMishar L'Umis HaZois. Regarding this new position that we've now discovered, which is called Ha-Navi, Mevi Gemara, the Gemara in Brachas brings down as a machlokes between Yeshaya Navi and between Chizkiyahu HaMelech. A machlokes between Yeshaya and Chizkiyahu. Im HaMelech halech l'Navi. Should the king go to the Navi or should the Navi go to the king? Ki Navi hazeh, because what Navi we're talking about? We're not talking about Stam rebel in some shtet. We're talking about Hanavi. Hanavi hazeh noisi ba'achas mimishris habechiris b'mamlacha. The Navi carries a position which is in truth the older position. In other words, by the times of, like I said, from the very beginning of leadership with Moshe, Yeshua, and to the Shoftim, the primary position was that of Torah, and Le'umius, national identity and politics, was subsumed in that. All of a sudden, by the times of the Melech, now it's split. But Yeshai Navi says, but I'm the oldest one, I'm the Bechar. In other words, my position of Torah, until now, by the earlier generations, you were a part of me. You were a subpart. You were a footnote in my Inyan. Now all of a sudden, the Melech, the political leader, political position, has now been separated. Over the Maisa, I'm still the Iker. Chizkiyahu Navi, Chizkiyahu HaMelech says now like that. Adrabah, it's taka true that you are the Bechar. That the earlier generations, the primary, like if you had to identify the role of the Shofet and so on, what was his primary position? It was that of Torah, and the position of political leadership was subsumed in that. But now that it has emerged as a separate force in the Melech, it's the Iker. So that was the machlokes between them back and forth. We'll see about that soon. Yeah. Oh, so that's good. We're going to see about that. That's where we have to get into the Pnimis. Yaakov doesn't talk about that. That's what we're going to see. Now the truth is we feel a little bit of this tug and war in that story when the Jewish people come to. This is the funny thing. We do have one of the mitzvahs in Torah is to appoint a king. So this idea of the political side of leadership sort of emerging out of the shadows and taking it and standing on its own 2 feet as a melech, and then Torah leadership being forced into one individual person called a Navi, the Torah evidently wants this, because that's one of the mitzvahs is to establish a king. So, but yet what's interesting is that at the time when we asked for a king, Shmuel Hanavi is upset about it, and Hashem says, it was a little bit like, the Rishonim deal with this. Like, were they supposed to ask for a king? Not supposed to. The pasuk. It's one of the mitzvahs. But this is we're going to have to see in the Pnimis. We're going to have to see this struggle of like, is this lechatchila, not lechatchila? Who's taka greater, the Navi or the Melech? Like, who's greater?
And who appoints the Navi? Like I said, the Harav is that the component of Navi?
So who appoints a Navi? So that's a good question. I mean, the Rambam talks about this. How do you know who's to verify someone as a legitimate prophet? That we have systems in place, right? Hanavi, that's gonna take Klal Yisrael's collective understanding for sure. So now he's makes another point. V'chein, another halacha that will become clear based on this. So we're gonna have to see. That we're gonna have to see. We'll see. V'chein had ein mamid and melech el al pi navi. The halacha is that to establish a king, you need a navi to give his stamp of approval on establishing a melech. So that's a halacha in the Rambam. It's a halacha in Gemara. It's recorded in the Rambam. So when you read that halacha, I've always read it as okay. You just need a navi. How many? Which navi? I don't know. There's a lot of Navi Baruch Hashem by Klal Yisrael at that time. So just get a navi to concede on the decision that the Sanhedrin are the ones also appointing the melech. So it's not like out of nowhere. So they just need a navi. So get a navi to be there. Says Rabbi Yaakov, no, it's not just Stam a navi. If you're talking about establishing a melech and you need a navi, what the halacha means is not just Stam. You need ha-navi, the navi of the generation. The navi of the people. Kinasan hanavi, like Nasan, Shemina Shloim HaMelech, who appointed Shloima, Shmuel hanavi, Shemina as Shaul David, like Shmuel hanavi that anointed Shaul and David, and so on. Now, what's interesting is that again, Weiter, based on this, in Maramaka number 5, Rabbi Yaakov makes another observation, which is very, very interesting. We find this clearly and openly by David HaMelech for sure. It's very, very clear, and Shaul as well. But Rabbi Yaakov makes a point that this is probably true throughout all the generations of kings, which is that this person that's the Navi Ha'umah, the Ha-Navi, also was sort of the private Navi for the Melech himself. That the Navi, there was a unique relationship between the Melech and Ha-Navi. They weren't just figures that had to deal with each other and console with each other at some time. Like there was an intimate bond between them. So it says like this, right? That's what you find like David and Melech throughout Navi, you find these many stories like this, is where you couldn't listen. If David Melch was, if a king was doing something wrong, then you can't just go and give mussar to the king. It doesn't work like that. But the personal mechiach, the personal Rebbe and manhig of the king, even on a personal level, was a Navi. Every melech had his Navi, who would be his balmusar, who would be his mashkiach, like, making sure that he's on the straight and narrow. And so says Rabbi Yaakov, he's going to make this point, is that this was also not just Am Navi, it was Hanavi. The Hanavi, not only was he now in charge of Torah, of passing over the Messiah, he was also the private machanech and the private manig and mashkiach and mashpia on the melech. That's what he was. So he says, Kol melech ha'imisiyait be'inyanav. Every melech had the responsibility of taking eitzah in his inyanim, im navi miyuchad, with a particular navi. Shalah ha'inavi ha'uma, who was the hanavi of the generation. Heim ha'yubali ha'kabbalah. Again, he repeats over this idea that this hanavi was primarily his job on a national stage, was transmitting the Messiah. But on a private level, he was also the personal mashpia and personal mashkiach of the melech. So it's like a very interesting role, where again, on the one hand, it's this very interesting tug of war, because on the one hand, the melech is now his own position of political leadership, but there is this, and not only does he have to consult every once in a while with the Navi to make sure that everyone's on the same page, but the Navi was his personal mashkiach. So it's like a very interesting thing. And yet, despite that, the Melech, like Chizkiyahu HaMelech, said, the Navi has to come to me. So it's a very interesting role, where it's like you would think, Rabbi Talmud or Mashkiach, and Bacher, whatever, whether the Melech comes on time to Shachris, the Navi would man him, like that's the Navi. So, but Mitzad Sheni, he's the Melech, and even when we find this in Nevi'im, that in Sefer Shmuel and Malachim, that when the Navi would give mussar to the Melech, it had to be bakavidik. The Navi couldn't just come and stop. Like there's a whole ma'aser when David HaMelech makes the mistake on his level with Bathsheba, so Nasan and Navi has to come and tell him, give him mussar. So what does Nasan do? Nasan Navi doesn't just say Davi made a mistake, do tshuvaton. No, he doesn't do it. What Nasan and Navi does is that he tells David HaMelech a whole ma'aser, that there was a farmer who only had one little shepsela, a whole thing, and he asked David HaMelech, what should we do with this? A certain mice that happened. Someone did something not nice to a poor farmer. What should we do to the person that ba'avel that did something not nice to the farmer? So David said, he did something not nice. It should be punished. So Navi says, you were that person. So you see, it wasn't direct. It wasn't harsh, but it was like bringing David along. It was bringing David along for him to discover it on his own. And that, again, this is part of the balancing act that the Navi had to do. He's the Navi, so he's the Mashpia, he has to do what his role is for the king, but it's also the king. Not as far as like I'm afraid of getting punished by the king, but it's a kavod malchus. So there, again, this is where we're feeling this tension between like who's greater, who's more powerful, what's the ideal position, what's the way it's supposed to be.
So the Navi enhanced the malchus on a personal level.
Right.
It worked that way. That's what the malchus made personally with the Navi.
So they would have a personal relationship, but the relationship was more mashpia. It was more mashpia and mashkiach. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the Navi was probably supported by the Melech. I would imagine the Gashmis was probably taken care of like that. But Enochanami, in terms of hashpa, it was that way. It was that way. So he says like this. So Rabbi Yaakov gives an example of this that you find in Navi. It says like this: V'yarmer Nasan el Hamelech. It's nice over there that David HaMelech had this idea of building a Beis HaMikdash. So what does he do? He doesn't just build a Beis HaMikdash. He goes to Nasan Navi and a Sharleitza. He asks Nasan Navi, "Is this a good idea to build a Beis HaMikdash?" And what's interesting is that V'yarmer Nasan el Hamelech. Nasan and Navi tells. It doesn't say Nasan Hanavi now, because this wasn't the nevuah. Nasan, as far as the mashkiach and the personal mashpia of David HaMelech, tells the Melech, it's not a good idea. Whatever you want to do. It's a good idea. You should build a Beis HaMikdash. Then the pasuk goes on that night the Rebbeinu Shalom brings a message of nevuah to Nasan and says it should not be by David. It's going to be by his son Shlomo HaMelech. So the next morning, it says V'yi Dvar Hashem al Nasan Leimer, that Hashem says to Nasan, it's not a good idea, it should not be David, it should be Shlomo. And then Nasan, then the pasuk says that Nasan Hanavi comes to Shlomo, David HaMelech, and says, Kaimar Hashem, it should not be by you, it should be by your son Shlomo. And so what you see is an amazing thing. In other words, what you see is that it was a pashut sach that if David has an idea, he goes to Nasan and he's asking Nasan what the right thing is. And Nasan doesn't say, let me wait until I get a nevuah about it. Nasan was comfortable answering the question as the personal Rebbe and the personal mashkiach and mashpia of David HaMelech. Happens to be, in this particular case, he got it wrong. So the Rebbe had to step in and tell him, it's not a good idea. But you see that the back and forth was like probably a standard thing. David HaMelech had a personal inyan he's going through, so he went to his mashpia and to talk about it. So he says, afterwards, then you needed the Rebbe to step in to make sure everyone's getting the right thing. Again, this is the idea that even after the person's a king, he's still subservient and tachas underneath the authority of Torah. This is what we have. So it's an interesting thing. Again, and going back to what I said before, this split between, again, what was until now under the general position of Shofet is now divided between Melech and Navi. So after Malchus ends, it goes back together under the Nasi / Reish Galusa. That's what we spoke about last week, is that this position of so it's like it starts off as Maisha, Tyra, and Nichlal, and that is political leadership. Then those two sides split from each other during the times of Malchus. But then when Malchus ends, it returns back to what it was initially, which is a Torah leadership. Subsumed within that is political power, and that was what the Nasi was. The Nasi, or the Reish Galusa, they were the Gedolei Hadar. They were the Torah leadership, and Nichlal in that was political authority, similar to what was before there was a time of kings. So, but the Tukuf of Malchus is where these two positions split from each other, and there's this like tug of war between the two of them. Who's greater? Who's not greater? Each one needs the other. Okay, so now let's understand the Pnimis. Huh?
When it goes back to the Reish Galusa, the nevuah was over then.
You're right. There was no nevuah anymore, but at least the Torah leadership and political leadership reunite under the position of Nasi. And again, just like it was pre-Malchus, the main position is that of Torah, and political power is Nichlal, and that is subsumed in that. Okay, so let's understand the Pnimis of what's going on here. This Inyan, and this is really what we're all struggling with. During this time of Malchus, where these two positions split and go to different people, is that a Yerida? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I mean, Klal Yisrael struggle with this. The pasuk says that there's a mitzvah of making a melech, which means it sounds like this is the plan. But it doesn't, like to us, we would say like this is not a good plan. Wouldn't it be better, like hashkafically, if the political leadership of Klal Yisrael would be under the same banner of Torah? Like, well, and that's really what Shmuel Navi says to Jewish people. Like, what's wrong until, like, what's so bad until you had Moshe, you had Shua, you had Shoftim, and it was all Torah, and everything was Das Torah, and Nichlal in that was also the political inyanim, but it was in the base measures. So why divide it up? Maybe is that because you read? Is it because we're not holding by such a madreg anymore? L'chara, it can't be, right? If you think about it, because after Malchus ends, which is even further generations, it goes back together to the times of the Shoftim. So if the reason why it has to be divided is because we're not holding by such a madrega, well, we got better after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. So what's going on over here? Okay, so it's like this. This tug of war boils down to a primary question and a fundamental question, which kind of always remains somewhat unresolved, which is, what is greater? What is higher? Who has a higher root? Torah or Klal Yisrael? Because that's really what this question is. These two positions, Torah and political, is really, it's Torah and Klal Yisrael. That's what it is. Klal Yisrael as a people. So when we're talking about earlier generations, Moshe, Yeshua, Shoftim, where it was Torah, leadership was Torah, and Klal Yisrael and Yanim were just a part of that. What was shining, a truth that was shining during those times was what? Is that Torah is the most important thing. The Rebbeinu Shalom loves Torah more than he loves Yidden. Because and that filters all the way down into this world. In what sense? Is that the leadership is Torah, and Klal Yisrael and Yanim is a part of that. All of a sudden, what emerges by the times of Malchus is maybe to a certain degree a deeper truth, which is that Klal Yisrael is not just a people that Hashem needs in order to carry out the Torah, and it's all Torah. All of a sudden, what emerges by the times of Kings is that Klal Yisrael have a shirish. We have an independent root by the Rabbanu Shalom, and not just people that are needed to carry out Torah. In other words, this is the question: is the Rabbanu Shalom, is it all really Torah, and it's just there needs to be a people? Like it's really all about like the mitzvah of Shabbos. Just you need people on planet Earth to facilitate the mitzvah of Shabbos being fulfilled. Or is it no? Or is it no? There's such a thing as Yidden, and the Rabbanu Shalom starts off with there's such a thing as Yidden, and the Rabbanu Shalom then has Torah to give to Yidden. Which one is it? This is the in a certain sense, this is one of the deepest inyanim and the deepest secrets of Teres Baal Shem Tov, of Teres Chassidus, and ultimately what Geula is about. Because Geula fundamentally, I'm giving Rashi Prakim over here. This is a very big sugya, but ultimately what Geula depends on is the Jewish people realizing that Klal Yisrael have a shirish that maybe could even be higher than Torah. And even though it's true that Torah is the guiding light for Klal Yisrael, but in the very depths of our essence, Yisrael Olu Machshavat Tchila, the Jewish people, come before anything else. And even though, ironically, when all these realities come into the world, Torah ends up being the guiding light for the Jewish people. Lav Dafka, that does not necessarily mean that in the highest root, Torah is higher than Klal Yisrael. And so this is what's emerging by the times of Malchus. It's not a Yerida, but what's emerging at the time of Malchus, what's being revealed at the time of Malchus is the independence of the Jewish people and the place that we have in the divine mind of the Rabbanu Shalom, that we are not just secondary aspects and necessary components to make sure Torah flourishes. No. Maybe quite the opposite. You can make the argument that's the opposite. Maybe it's all about Yidden, and the Torah was created to give us direction in life. But it's about Yidden. It's about having Nishmas Yisrael. And this ultimately is the tug of war between Yeshaya Navi and Chizkiah HaMelech. Which one goes to who? That's a fundamental question. Is it Torah and Yidden are secondary, or is it Yidden and Torah is secondary? So you have Marmar Kamis in both ways. Yeah. So Teres Baal Shem Tov is primarily about this. You know, if you compare again, this is a sugya by itself. It's the sugya, but it's, you know, like when you learn the Kisvei Ari. So the Kisvei Ari, really the Kisvei Ari is all about Torah. It's really all about how high and how far-reaching the unbelievably high origins of the 613. And every mitzvah that we have in this world is mamish coming from the highest place. And really that's what all of Kisvei Ari is really unpackaging and revealing to us. But there is always one question that remains. I mentioned this before. There's always one question remains after all of the Kisvei Ari, which is, so you're telling me, Arizal, that tefillin is mamish the highest thing in the universe, and it shakes up. The question is, but how do I have such a high reach? Like what? So all of that is now you're saying that, and I put on tefillin, right? And when I put on tefillin, I'm causing all of that. So the reason I'm saying, so when the end of tefillin starts at mamish, the highest place in the universe, but you're telling me that that's activated by me down here putting on tefillin. How does that work? In Chassidus, we're taught that the very idea that we are the ones able to activate such high-reaching forces through the mitzvahs is indicative of the fact that the very root of Nishmas Yisrael comes higher than that. Only if you're higher than the buttons, then you can push the buttons. If you're lower than the buttons, how can you push the buttons? And so you can make the argument that no, really we're lower than the buttons, and the Rebbeinu Shalom is pushing the buttons, so to speak. But the Rebbeinu Shalom decided that he's going to push the buttons if he sees us putting on tefillin. But the Baal Shem Tov said that's an underdeveloped picture of what Klal Yisrael is. That's maybe what the Navi would want to believe. But what the Melech says is, no. You are pushing the buttons. How are you pushing the buttons? You have to be higher than the buttons to push them. The answer is, Enochanami, you're higher than the buttons. You're telling me that Nishmas Yisrael is higher than Torah? Said the Baal Shem Tov, yes. This is and you learn in Tzivah Chassidus, especially Chabad Chassidus and so on, this is a major sugya by the Middle Rebbe a lot. Nishmas Yisrael being a higher root in its shirish than Torah. And this is where you have this funny dynamic, that by the time those two realities called Torah and Klal Yisrael come down already and materialize, Torah is superior to us. Torah is the guiding force in our lives. We have to submit to Torah's will. But that picture of Torah being on top of us and guiding us is not necessarily the truth in terms of the very root of these realities. So there's the relationship of Torah and Klal Yisrael as it's materialized down here, but then there's a relationship between Torah and Klal Yisrael in its highest root. And down here, Torah is sort of guiding the Jewish people, and the Jewish people have to be machniya, we have to submit ourselves to the rule of Torah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in the highest root, we're not the ones pushing the buttons. So the highest root, Nishmas Yisrael, can be higher. And this is the tug of war between the Melech and the Navi. But the very idea of the Melech being his own authority and moving out of the shadows from the Shofet, from the Torah authority, is to a certain degree a deep revelation of Shirish Nishmas Yisrael. And the ultimate gula of Yemais Mashiach, which is about the Malchus Beis David returning, like the Rambam, like I mentioned this many times, the Rambam describes Mashiach as the return of Malchus Beis David to its original glory. That's fundamentally what Malchus Mashiach is about. To a certain degree, the inyan of Malchus HaMashiach and the inyan of Geula is this Giloi, that Nishmas Yisrael is higher than Torah. And that to a certain degree, without going into Arichas, this is also, Torah also this also completes Torah. Because even Torah gains from an understanding that Klal Yisrael are pushing the buttons. Otherwise, the whole system of Torah becomes one of like, just reward and punishment. Hashem says, you do good things, I'll give you good things. As opposed to being a system which is holistic and makes sense. That it's not just we do tefillin down here and Hashem does push the buttons above. We are pushing the buttons. There's a holistic system to Yiddishkeit. And that's what Gula is about. Let's just finish up, yeah? The Yesh Amiti, exactly. That's the dynamic that we're talking about over here. But again, because the shirish because the relationship between Torah and Klal Yisrael in its shirish is different than how it manifests itself down here, that's why it creates this tug of war. So on the one hand, the Melech says to the Navi, you come to me, but yet the Navi is the personal mashpia of the Melech. So it's like, but again, that's where it's coming from. Take a look at Maramaka number 6. We'll go through quickly. There's a piece from Tanad Velyo. It's a Medrash, Tanad Velyo Rava, Perak Yudalit. So I mentioned this before. V'amrali Adam Echel Elyo. So Navi says the following Maisa in Tanad Velyo. He says, a person once approached me. He says, Rebbe, there are two things in the world, and I love them with all my heart. What are the two things that I love, says the person to Eliyahu Navi? Torah v'Yisrael. Torah v'Yisrael. It's a Gavaldig Devach. But which one should I love more? That's the question. Which one should I love? Should I love Torah more or should I love Yidden more? That was the question that was presented to Eliyahu Navi. So Navi says, I told him like this, Bini, my son. This is an amazing thing. Darkan shel b'nei adam oimrim ha-Torah kadam. If you ask people, the way of the world is, Torah comes first. That's what people will tell you. Shenamar, and they'll quote a pasuk. Hashem keneni roishes darka, kadam efalav mi'oz, psukim. Aval ani oimer, but you're asking me, if you're asking me, I'm telling you, Yisrael kadmai. That Klal Yisrael comes first. Shenamar kodesh Yisrael, Hashem reishes tefillah. So it's an amazing thing, because the person asked Eliyahu Navi, obviously he's asking for Eliyahu Navi's opinion. Why does Eliyahu Navi have to give a hakdama? If you ask other people, they'll tell you this. You ask me, I'll tell you that. Well, I'm asking you. I'm not asking other people. So it says for something like this. Marambok number 7, Tzidkas Tzadik, in Kuf Tzadivav, Tzidkas
Is that what it
Tzadik.
means by Derech Kadmon Torah? That's totally different.
It's a similar Indian. Derech Eretz means to be a mensch, to be a person.
Be part of it.
That's it, right? Kikach umitzad b'nei Adam. So it says for Tzadik like this. Both are true, but one is what it is in its ideal shirish state, and one is sort of how it materializes down here. As far as people are concerned, in other words, when Eliyahu is saying that if you ask other people, they'll tell you Torah, that means in this world, and it's the way these two realities of Torah and Klal Yisrael materialize down here, what comes first? Torah. Torah is the guiding light, and then the Navi is the mashpi on the Melech. And even says Tzaddik in a person's personal progression in Avodas Hashem, That's the path that you have to pick first. First, you have to love Torah more than you love Yidden. You have to see Torah as the primary force. Lahachnes belief. First, that's the first love that you have to bring into your heart. The Cheinhoya, now you find this with Klal Yisrael's history. Man Torah, v'achakacha K'nisa L'Aretz. Right. First we had Har Sinai, which is Torah, and then we got Eretz Yisrael, which is Avos Yisrael. So first Torah, and then Yid. Right, and that's the process that we have to go through on a personal level. The Chein Haziva Keseh Seder, and the same thing is, God forbid, with Golas. First we abandoned Torah. Right, that was the first base of Mikdash, and then we abandoned Avos Yisrael. That was the second base of Mikdash. So you see, both in terms of building ourselves in terms of growing in Madregas, and God forbid, when things deteriorate, it's always in that model: first Torah, and then Yidden, and that's the way it has to be down here, or in a person's personal avoid and progression. Ach mitzad Hashem Yisparach, but when it comes to the Rebbeinu Shloim, from the highest position, the highest perspective. Reishis Tuvuasa Heim Nishmas Heim Nefashis Yisrael. The highest thing, the most original thing, is Klal Yisrael. Ve'im Kailam Kol Torah Kula, and Torah is contained within Klal Yisrael, and all of Torah is created to create to unpackage Nishmas Yisrael. Rak she'etzlam hayu sasam. In Klal Yisrael, the Torah is hidden. V'ator hu pirish al zeh, and the Torah is a commentary to Nishmas Yisrael. That's how it is in the highest source. And that's what Navi is saying to this person. If you ask everyone, they'll tell you Torah, and then call Yisrael. If you're asking me, and Navi is the site of Gula, right? It's redemption, it's Mashiach, Navi. So he says that if you're asking me, it's Klal Yisrael, then Torah. And when a person reaches the top of the mountain, so in order to get to the top, you have to go from Torah then to Avos Yisrael. But once you get to the destination, you realize that Avos Yisrael kedemes, that Avos Yisrael is the most important thing. Shemei Iker, that Klal Yisrael is the Iker, v'Ashayra, v'Sharash Torah, and the root of Torah itself. Torah, and then Torah comes l'farish l'havin hamamakim, to give explanation, to give context to the depth. Haganuzim b'Kol Nefesh B'Atam Yisrael, to give depth and context to what it is, what is a Yid. But that's what Torah is, and this is a tug of war. The union between a melech and a navi, and that's why, again, going back, that's why it's this funny thing. There is the Torah says there's a mitzvah to appoint a melech, but yet when it came time to do it, there was this this inner struggle of Klal Yisrael. Should we do it? Should we not? Is it the right thing? Because this is what we're dealing with. Like again, Darkan Shel Bnei Adam, the way of this world is Torah, and then Klal Yisrael, which means that a melech is inappropriate to have. But in the Shirish Hadavar, it's Klal Yisrael and then Torah, which means that the Melech is the ideal state to be in. So this is what we deal with. Listen, at the end of the day, we have to be, we have to daven very much that Mashiach should come, and all this truth should be manifest in full. We should be zeichet to have a Melech and Hanavi and Torah and Klal Yisrael and Torah. We should be able to have shalom between us and be zeichet to experience that. And I niglam b'yis kol tzedek me'er v'yemen on.
What happened in the end of the year?